The wind ripped through the test runway at Wright-Patterson AFB in Ohio on a frigid January morning in 1944. The overcast sky reflected the tension hanging over Hangar Number 17, where engineers from the Aeronautical Materiel Command silently observed the silver prototype parked out front. It was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, but something about it seemed different. Its wings displayed a contour that defied decades of aerodynamic orthodoxy. They weren't straight. They didn't follow established logic. They were curved, almost organic, as if someone had designed the impossible and decided to build it anyway. No one talked about it openly, but everyone knew that plane shouldn't have been there. The design had been rejected 3 times by the upper echelons. Wind tunnel simulations indicated instability. Mathematical calculations suggested excessive turbulence at high speeds. And yet Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born chief engineer based in the United States, had persisted, not with arrogance, but with the implacable calm of someone who saw something others couldn't. He didn't argue. He simply sketched, adjusted, recalculated, and presented the concept again, always slightly modified, always one step more refined. The war in Europe was already consuming its 3rd winter. Reports arrived weekly from the European Theatre of Operations, US. Army Air Force pilots were facing German Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, which outperformed them in top speed and maneuverability at altitude. The difference was measured in kilometers per hour, but felt in lives. Every escort mission over occupied Germany meant impossible choices: protect the bombers or pursue the interceptors. American pilots flew rugged, reliable aircraft, but too slow to dominate modern aerial combat. They needed something more. Not just raw power, but radical aerodynamic efficiency. Kartveli knew the numbers by heart. The standard P-47's terminal speed, 668 kilometers per hour in a controlled dive. Sustainable cruising speed, 540 kilometers per hour. Ideal operating altitude, 7,500 meters. Absolute ceiling, 13,000 meters. These values were respectable, but insufficient. Combat reports showed that German fighters easily reached 700 kilometers per hour in level flight at altitude. The math was cruel. A slower aircraft always loses the tactical initiative. No matter how well armed it is, if it can't choose when to fight, it's doomed to react. And reacting in the air usually means death. Kartveli's proposed concept was technically heretical. He wanted to completely redesign the Thunderbolt's wing profile, replacing the traditional straight wing with a modified elliptical configuration with a progressive taper that would reduce parasitic drag at relative supersonic speeds. The idea wasn't fundamentally new. The British had used elliptical wings on the Supermarine Spitfire, but Kartveli proposed something different: an asymmetric ellipse with a greater chord at the root and a non-linear taper toward the tip. This, in theory, would redistribute aerodynamic pressure more efficiently, delaying the point of laminar flow separation and maintaining lift even at extreme angles of attack. The problem was that no one had tested this on a real scale. The Navier-Stokes equations that govern the behavior of moving fluids had been known for decades, but solving them for complex geometries at high speeds was still a mathematical problem without a closed analytical solution. Kartveli worked with approximations, intuition refined by years of experience, and a kind of calculated faith. He wasn't a dreamer. He was an engineer who understood that sometimes the only way to prove something works is to build it and observe what happens. Pure science had its limits. Engineering was the art of overcoming them. Inside the hangar, the prototype waited. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine, with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, could generate 2,500 horsepower under ideal conditions. But power without aerodynamic efficiency was just wasted fuel. The real challenge lay in how the air would flow over those redesigned wings. If Kartveli was right, the plane would gain between 240 and 320 kilometers per hour of maximum sustainable speed. If he was wrong, the prototype would disintegrate in flight, or worse, enter an irrecoverable spin on its first high-speed test. The base commander, Colonel Benjamin Chidlaw, a veteran of campaigns in the Pacific and a man known for his intolerant approach to unnecessary experimentation, watched from afar. He disliked Kartveli, not personally. The engineer was polite, methodical, and almost invisible socially, but for the way he defied protocol, without ever directly confronting anyone. Chedlaw saw this as a silent form of insubordination. Kartveli didn't ask permission. He built, tested small parts, tweaked, and presented partial results as if they were inevitable. It was a risky but effective strategy. It's hard to reject something that already exists and works, even partially. The test pilot assigned to the inaugural flight was Captain James Howard, 32, born in Canton, Ohio, and a mechanical engineering graduate from Ohio State University before joining the military aviation. Howard wasn't a spectacular pilot, but he was precise. His flight notes were read by engineers as technical literature. He described aerodynamic behavior with the clarity of someone who understood the physics behind the controls. Kartveli had personally chosen him. He needed someone who could distinguish between structural instability and unconventional aerodynamic behavior. Howard could do that. Most importantly, he didn't panic. The decision to fly that day was unofficial. The schedule called for 2 more weeks of ground tests, systems checks, and structural load simulations. But Kartveli knew time was running out. Recent reports indicated that the Luftwaffe was developing new jet interceptors. If the Germans fielded turbine-powered fighters before the Allies had an adequate aerodynamic response, the air war would change irreversibly. There was no room for bureaucratic perfectionism. They needed to know now if that wing worked. Howard understood the urgency without being explicitly told. He simply checked the instruments, adjusted his leather helmet, and climbed into the cockpit. The Republic P-47's engine roared for the first time at 7:43 that morning. The sound was different than expected. Not just the deep rhythmic roar of 18 cylinders firing in sequence, but something more subtle, a resonance that seemed to come from the very structure of the aircraft, as if the fuselage were responding harmoniously to the vibration. Kartveli, standing next to the runway with a notebook in his hands, looked up. He knew that sound. It was the indication that the torsional rigidity of the new wing was within the calculated parameters. The 7,075 aluminum spars, reinforced with ribs spaced every 30 centimeters, were distributing the load exactly as predicted in the drawings. It still didn't prove the plane would fly well, but it did indicate that it wouldn't disintegrate at the first effort. Howard moved slowly down the runway, testing the surface controls. The ailerons responded firmly, but required more lateral pressure than on the standard model. This was to be expected. The new wing geometry shifted the center of aerodynamic pressure slightly aft, requiring adjustments to the control cables. He compensated mentally, memorizing the new control sensitivity. Elevator stable, rudder with linear response, everything within acceptable limits. Gradually, he increased the engine speed to 1,800 revolutions per minute, keeping the brakes on as he felt the aircraft pull against the wheels. The power was there. Now it was a question of whether the wing could convert it into controlled lift. Official protocol called for an assisted takeoff, with a support aircraft following the prototype in parallel flight for visual observation. But Howard had dispensed with this. He argued that the presence of another aircraft nearby would create wake turbulence that would contaminate the initial data. True, but it was also a polite way of saying he preferred to be alone if something went wrong. No one needed to witness a fatal error. He released the brakes and pushed the throttle to the limit. The Thunderbolt accelerated with surprising determination, gaining speed more quickly than the conventional model, 40 kilometers per hour, 50, 100. The concrete runway slid beneath the wheels as the speedometer climbed, 120, 140. It was at 160 kilometers per hour that something unexpected happened. The aircraft didn't just lift its nose, it practically leaped off the runway. Howard felt the abrupt transition between roll and flight, a change so defined it almost felt like an invisible step in the air. It wasn't smooth, it was assertive. The modified elliptical wing was generating lift with an efficiency that surpassed even Kartveli's most optimistic projections. The angle of attack required for takeoff was lower, which meant less induced drag, which in turn meant faster acceleration. Howard stabilized the climb at 15 degrees, adjusted the trim and began gaining altitude. By 500 meters, it was clear the plane wasn't unstable. It was just different. On the ground, Kartveli watched through binoculars. He wasn't smiling. He never smiled during tests, but his posture had changed. His shoulders were slightly more relaxed. He was jotting something down on his pad, probably calculations for climb time and rate of change. Beside him, a junior engineer, Thomas Beckett, 26, a recent graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, held a stopwatch and a theoretical performance graph. Beckett was nervous, spoke too quickly, and asked too many questions, but Kartveli kept him close because he understood math intuitively. Beckett muttered something about the climb rate being 12% higher than predicted. Kartveli just nodded, never taking his eyes off the sky. Howard reached 10,000 feet in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. This was extraordinary. The standard P-47 took at least 8.5 minutes to reach the same altitude. The difference seemed small on paper, but in combat it meant reaching the intercept point before the enemy, or escaping an unfavorable situation with enough time to reposition. He stabilized the flight, adjusted the fuel mixture, and began testing the controls at different speeds. First, slow flight, 100 miles per hour close to stall. The wing maintained lift without severe buffeting. The nose wanted to drop, but predictably, with no tendency to spin. A good sign. Then, I reached cruising speed, 480 kilometers per hour. It felt like gliding on invisible rails. Drag seemed to have decreased dramatically. Howard noticed he needed less power to maintain speed than in the old model. This meant fuel savings, which meant greater range, which meant longer missions without refueling. Every small aerodynamic advantage multiplied into operational gains. He pushed the throttle again, accelerating to 540 kilometers per hour. The plane responded effortlessly. 600, 620, 640. The structure vibrated slightly, but nothing alarming. It was the characteristic vibration of a still laminar airflow, not the chaotic tremor that precedes turbulent separation. It was then that Howard decided to do what he wasn't authorized to do. He pitched the nose down and entered a controlled dive. The official purpose of the flight was to test basic cruise stability, not to push the performance envelope to the limit. But Howard knew the truly important data lay beyond the comfort zone. It was at the extremes that an aircraft's true characteristics revealed themselves. He monitored the airspeedometer as gravity and engine power combined to accelerate the Thunderbolt. 680, 700, 720. The sound of the wind over the fuselage grew ever higher, almost a piercing whistle. 740. The wing began to exhibit curious behavior. Instead of progressively losing lift, as would be expected at speeds near the compressible limit, it seemed to dynamically redistribute pressure. Howard could feel it through the controls. A firm, but not rigid resistance, as if the structure itself were absorbing and redistributing aerodynamic forces. Kartveli had mentioned this at a technical meeting weeks earlier, something about the progressive taper creating a sort of aerodynamic relief valve that delayed the onset of compressible effects. At the time, no one had fully believed it. Now Howard was experiencing theory transformed into real physics. At 760 kilometers per hour, he gently pulled back on the stick, initiating the recovery from the dive. The G-force increased steadily, twice gravity, then 3, then 4. Howard felt the weight pressing his body against the seat, his peripheral vision darkening slightly as blood was forced downward. But the plane responded. There was no judder, no tendency to roll involuntarily. The trajectory was smooth, almost mathematical. At 8,000 feet he leveled off again. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with something close to technical awe. This was working. It was working better than any projection suggested. Kartveli on the ground lowered his binoculars. He saw the silvery silhouette descend at a steep angle and then rise again, tracing a perfect parabola in the grey sky. I didn't need telemetry to know what had just happened. Howard had tested the limit, and the wing had held. Beckett, beside him, began asking rapid-fire questions about whether this was in the protocol, whether the data would be valid, whether they should abort the test. Kartveli simply replied that the protocol was a guide, not a prison. The real test always begins where the planning ends. Howard initiated his landing approach after 19 minutes of flight. He gradually reduced power, adjusted the flaps, and lined up with the runway. The descent was steady, almost monotonous in its predictability. He touched down smoothly, the main wheels making contact almost simultaneously. He rolled halfway down the runway before applying the brakes. When he finally stopped and shut down the engine, the silence that followed seemed unreal. Howard remained in the cockpit for a few seconds, processing what he had just experienced. This wasn't just an improved airplane, it was a paradigm shift. The Air Materiel Command conference room smelled of cold coffee and carbon paper. It was late afternoon on the same day as the test flight, and the orange light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the mahogany table where 6 men pored over graphs and performance charts. Kartveli sat at the opposite end from Colonel Chidlaw, who was leafing through Howard's preliminary report with an unreadable expression. Beside the colonel, Major William Kepner, liaison officer to the 8th Bomber Command based in England, drummed his fingers on the table. He had flown in specially from Washington to assess whether the program was worth the continued investment. The pressure was silent but absolute. Howard presented the data with the precision of someone who knew every number would be questioned. Maximum speed reached in a controlled dive, 762 kilometers per hour. Sustainable cruise speed at an altitude of 6,000 meters, 630 kilometers per hour. Rate of climb to 3,000 meters, 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Fuel consumption per kilometer flown, 17% lower than the standard model. Each metric represented a measurable tactical advantage. Kepner interrupted to ask about high-speed controllability. Howard replied that the plane not only remained controllable, but became more stable as speed increased, a behavior opposite to that expected from conventional wings. Chidlaw wasn't convinced. He pointed to a note in the report where Howard mentioned a dynamic pressure redistribution that he attributed to the modified wing profile. The colonel wanted to know if this was science or speculation. Howard admitted he didn't have sufficient instrumentation to measure the pressure distribution in real time during flight, but that the control response clearly indicated aerodynamic behavior different from that predicted by classical theory. Kartveli intervened, explaining that the wing geometry created a gradual transition between different flow regimes, preventing the abrupt formation of shock waves that characterize the compressible barrier. Chidlaw asked if he could prove this mathematically. Kartveli replied that he could present the partial differential equations, but solving them without computers would take months. The only real proof was in the flight data. Kepner asked the question everyone was avoiding. How long would it take to put this wing into mass production? Kartveli calculated mentally, redesign the stamping tools, adjust the assembly lines, train technicians in new riveting and welding sequences. If they started immediately, with top priority and unlimited resources, perhaps 4 months until the first batch of 10 operational units. Kepner shook his head. 4 months was an eternity. Intelligence reports indicated that the Luftwaffe was concentrating new fighter groups equipped with improved versions of the Focke-Wulf 190D, which could reach speeds approaching 720 kilometers per hour. If the Americans didn't have an answer by spring, they would lose air superiority over occupied Germany. It was Beckett who suggested something unexpected. He sat in the corner of the room, almost invisible among the senior officers, but his mind raced alongside the discussion. Beckett proposed modifying only half of the current fleet of P-47s, starting with the aircraft already scheduled for preventative maintenance. During the structural overhaul process, the old wings would be replaced with the new ones. This would distribute the work across several facilities simultaneously and allow part of the fleet to be kept operational while the rest was upgraded. It wasn't elegant, but it was feasible. Kartveli looked at the young engineer with something close to respect. The idea had merit. Chidlaw asked about the costs. Beckett already had the numbers. Each set of modified wings would cost approximately $1,200 in materials and labor, compared to $800 for the standard version. The $400 per aircraft difference seemed significant until put into perspective. A single B-17 bomber cost $238,000. If the new wing saved a single bomber by allowing its escort fighters to intercept attackers more quickly, the investment was already justified. Kepner noted this. Hard numbers had persuasive power that rhetoric did not. The discussion moved on to operational risks. What if the new wing developed structural failures after hundreds of flight hours? What if its aerodynamic behavior changed in extreme weather conditions, such as ice storms over the North Atlantic, or severe turbulence in low-pressure fronts? Howard responded that all aircraft design involves uncertainty, but that the initial data was solid enough to justify limited production, followed by actual operational evaluation. Kartveli added that he had already designed additional spar reinforcements to ensure a structural safety margin, even beyond the intended flight envelope. Kepner finally made a decision. He would authorize the production of 50 sets of modified wings for installation on selected aircraft of the 4th Fighter Group, based in Debden, England. These units would be operated by experienced pilots, veterans of at least 20 combat missions. capable of critically evaluating performance in real situations. If field reports confirmed the advantages observed in the tests, production would be expanded. If they revealed unforeseen problems, the program would be terminated before committing vital resources. It was a calculated gamble, the kind of decision that characterized wartime military engineering, proceeding with incomplete information because waiting for absolute certainty meant losing. The meeting ended at 7:17. Kartveli walked slowly out of the administrative building, his hands in the pockets of his wool coat. The sky was dark, and a light snow was beginning to fall, blanketing the base in a white silence. He considered what he had just accomplished. It wasn't enthusiastic approval, but it was enough. 50 aircraft, 50 opportunities to prove that an idea rejected 3 times could change the course of a war. Beckett caught up with him minutes later, breathless, wanting to discuss the next steps, the timelines, the manufacturing sequences. Kartveli simply said the real work would begin tomorrow. At that moment, it was time to acknowledge that something significant had been accomplished. 2.5 months later, in March 1944, the first 12 aircraft equipped with the modified wing arrived at Debden AFB, Essex, England. Transport had been made by cargo ship across the Atlantic, the wings carefully packed in wooden crates lined with sawdust and waxed to protect against moisture. Installation was overseen by a technical team led by Beckett himself, who had crossed the ocean on the same ship to ensure that the assembly procedures were followed exactly as specified. Every bolt had a defined torque. Every joint had a specific tightening sequence. There was no room for improvisation. The pilots of the 4th Fighter Group greeted the new aircraft with polite skepticism. They were practical men, hardened by months of combat over hostile territory, and they had learned to be wary of innovations that came with grandiose promises. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Clark, 34, a veteran of 47 missions, examined the modified wing with a technical eye. He immediately noticed the difference in shape, the curvature that seemed almost artistic in its smoothness. He asked Beckett if it actually worked, or if it was just an engineer's theory. Beckett replied that he would find out for himself in a few hours. The first operational flight with the new aircraft was scheduled for March 18th, an escort mission for B-17 bombers attacking railway installations in Augsburg, Germany. 12 modified P-47s were accompanied by 18 standard P-47s for direct comparison. The order was simple: maintain formation, protect the bombers, and if possible, observe performance differences. Clark would lead the modified group. Before takeoff, he gathered his pilots and said something that would become legendary among the base's mechanics. If these engineers are right, we'll know in 15 minutes. If they're wrong, we'll know in 10. The formation took off at 8:12 a.m. under partly cloudy skies. The initial climb to escort altitude, 7,000 meters, revealed the first significant difference. The modified P-47s reached operational altitude 3 minutes earlier than the standard models, even while maintaining the same power setting. Clark noticed he was using less force on the controls to maintain formation. The aircraft seemed to hover with less effort, as if the air were carrying it more efficiently. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable, and in combat, every little advantage adds up. The formation crossed the English Channel at 9:41 a.m., entering occupied French airspace. The morning sun reflected off the low clouds blanketing the territory below, transforming the landscape into a sea of white, interrupted only by occasional peaks of high ground. Clark kept his squadron in echelon formation. The 12 modified P-47s divided into 3 elements of 4 aircraft each, positioned 1,500 meters above and slightly ahead of the B-17 bombers, following in tight columns. The radio remained in disciplined silence. Any unnecessary communication could reveal positions and intentions to the enemy. At an altitude of 10,200 meters over the Lorraine region, the first visual contact with German fighters was established. There were 8 Focke-Wulf 190Ds, recognizable by their elongated engine cowlings and aggressive fuselage profile. They were climbing rapidly from the south, taking advantage of the sun at their backs to make visual detection difficult. The tactic was classic: position themselves with an advantage in altitude and energy before initiating a dive attack on the bombers. Clark spotted them first, small dark dots against the intense blue of the sky at altitude. He radioed briefly. "Bandits, 4 o'clock high, 8 contacts." There was no panic. just immediate position adjustments and mental preparation for the coming combat. What happened in the next few minutes challenged Clark's accumulated experience from nearly 50 previous missions. He increased power to intercept the German fighters before they could reach the bombers, expecting the slow, gradual response that characterized the standard P-47. But the plane accelerated with surprising urgency. Speed rose from 500 to 600 kilometers per hour in less than 20 seconds. Then 620, 640, 660. Clark realized he was gaining altitude and speed simultaneously, something that should be mutually exclusive according to basic physics. The modified wing was converting power into performance with an efficiency he had never experienced before. The German pilots, Luftwaffe veterans with months of combat over French and German territory, noticed the P-47s approaching and reacted as expected. Two of them initiated evasive maneuvers, rolling left in steep turns, to try to force the Americans to lose speed. It was a proven tactic. Standard Thunderbolts couldn't follow tight turns without rapidly bleeding energy, which gave the German fighters time to reposition and counterattack. But Clark followed the turn without difficulty. The plane responded with unexpected agility, maintaining speed even at bank angles above 60 degrees. He noticed that the controls didn't feel as heavy as usual. The new wing distributed the aerodynamic load differently, allowing tighter maneuvers without compromising speed. The first Focke-Wulf attempted a vertical dive, accelerating to over 700 kilometers per hour as it descended toward the low clouds. It was a last-ditch maneuver, gambling that the pursuer wouldn't be able to keep up without losing control at high speed. Clark didn't hesitate. He pushed the stick forward and continued the dive, keeping the German fighter in the instrument panel's telescopic sight. 720 kilometers per hour, 740, 760. The plane vibrated but remained controllable. The structure groaned under the pressure, but there were no signs of failure. At 780 kilometers per hour, Clark was less than a quarter of a mile from the target. He pulled the trigger on the wing-mounted 50-caliber machine guns. 8 guns fired simultaneously, sending tracer bursts toward the German fighter. The first burst passed over the target. Clark adjusted slightly, compensating for deflection and distance. The second burst struck the Focke-Wulf's left wing, tearing off chunks of metal that glinted briefly in the sun before disappearing in the wind's velocity. The German pilot attempted a right roll, but the aircraft was already compromised. He broke out of combat formation, descending in an uncontrolled spiral as he tried to stabilize his flight. Clark didn't follow. There were other targets, and the priority was protecting the bombers. 2 kilometers above, another fight was unfolding. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 24, born in Portland, Oregon, was flying one of the modified P-47s for the first time in combat. He was facing a Focke-Wulf, trying to position himself behind him in a classic tail chase. Hayes executed a sharp reversal maneuver, rolling 180 degrees while pulling back on the stick, converting horizontal speed into a sudden change of direction. The movement should have bled off almost all of his kinetic energy, leaving him vulnerable. But the modified wing maintained lift even at the extreme angle, and Hayes completed the reversal with enough speed to get behind the German fighter, which seconds before had been in an advantageous position. The German pilot realized it too late. He tried to accelerate straight ahead, but Hayes was already within effective range. He fired a short burst, 3 seconds of concentrated fire that hit the Focke-Wulf's rear fuselage. Dark smoke began to pour from the engine. The German fighter rapidly lost speed, and the pilot ejected from the cockpit, opening his parachute as he slowly descended toward French territory below. Hayes didn't celebrate. He scanned the sky visually, searching for new threats, and returned to the escort formation. The fight had lasted less than 4 minutes, but it felt like a compressed eternity. The 6 remaining Focke-Wulfs quickly retreated. Their pilots were experienced enough to recognize when the tactical advantage had shifted. They didn't know what made those P-47s different, but they realized they were faster, more agile, and able to maintain energy in maneuvers that would have exhausted them. German doctrine emphasized economy of resources. It wasn't worth risking trained pilots in unfavorable combat. They descended quickly, disappearing into the clouds and leaving the sky clear for the American bombers to complete their mission. Clark reorganized the formation as the B-17s continued toward the target. He mentally checked his aircraft. Fuel consumption was slightly above normal due to the high power maintained during the fight, but still within safe margins. Ammunition remaining, approximately 60%. The airframe appeared intact with no signs of damage or abnormal vibrations, but most important was the mental sensation. For the first time in months, he felt he was in complete control of the engagement. He wasn't desperately reacting to enemy maneuvers, but dictating the pace of the fight. It was a subtle difference to outside observers, but absolute to those experiencing it. The formation completed its escort to the target, watched the bombers drop their payloads over the Augsburg rail yards, and began their return to base. The return flight was silent. No further attacks occurred. At 1:57 p.m., Clark landed at Debden, followed by the other 11 modified P-47s. All returned. No losses. It was a statistically unlikely outcome for a fight against 8 enemy fighters. Normally, one would expect at least 1 or 2 losses or severely damaged aircraft. But that day, the technical advantage had translated directly into operational superiority. Beckett was on the runway when the pilots disembarked. He carried a notebook and an anxious expression, waiting for the first reports of actual combat performance. Clark climbed down from the cockpit, removed his leather helmet and walked over to the engineer. Beckett began asking technical questions about controllability, control response at high speed, and any anomalous behavior observed. Clark interrupted him with a single sentence that summed it all up. It works better than you promised." There was no exaggeration in his voice, just the factual observation of someone who had just witnessed theory transform into measurable tactical superiority. In the following weeks, reports began to pile up on Kartveli's desk, still in Ohio. Each mission added more data to the growing body of evidence. Sustainable combat speed, confirmed above 400 miles per hour. High-speed maneuverability, superior to forecast. Fuel consumption per mission, within estimates. Engagement survival rate, 19% above the average for units equipped with standard P-47s. Each number validated the technical decisions made months earlier, when the modified wing was still just a controversial design, rejected by review committees. But Kartveli wasn't celebrating. He knew that 50 aircraft wouldn't win a war. The real challenge now was to industrialize the process, to transform a successful experiment into mass production. This meant convincing factories to revamp assembly lines, training thousands of workers in new procedures, and ensuring consistent quality in every wing produced. It was a completely different but equally critical engineering problem, and time remained short. The spring of 1944 brought accelerated changes to aircraft production lines in the United States. In April, 3 main factories, Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, Curtiss Wright in Buffalo, New York, and a newly converted facility in Evansville, Indiana, received authorization to begin mass production of the modified wings. The initial order was for 800 units by the end of June, an aggressive schedule that required 24-hour shifts and emergency recruitment of technical staff. Kartveli divided his time between the 3 facilities, personally supervising the first batches to ensure every critical detail was replicated with absolute precision. The industrialization process revealed challenges not evident in the handcrafted prototypes. The wing's elliptical curvature required stamping in multiple stages, each with tolerances of less than 0.5 millimeter. Microscopic errors in the aluminum forming accumulated throughout the structure, resulting in wings that appeared visually identical but had slightly different aerodynamic pressure distributions. Kartveli developed a system of dimensional verification jigs that allowed deviations to be identified before final assembly. Each wing was measured at 17 specific points, and any variation greater than 0.3 of a millimeter resulted in rejection. Beckett, now promoted to assistant chief engineer, coordinated the training of factory workers. Many were women who had joined the industrial workforce during the war, replacing men sent to the battlefields. They quickly learned to operate the massive hydraulic presses that shaped aluminum sheets, to align rivet holes with sub-millimeter precision, and to visually identify microscopic defects in welds. Beckett discovered that many had superior manual dexterity to the veteran operators, especially in tasks that required patience and attention to minute details. Average production quality improved noticeably in the following weeks. Meanwhile, in Europe, the modified wing was beginning to fundamentally alter the dynamics of aerial combat. By May, more than 200 aircraft equipped with the new profile were operating in fighter squadrons distributed between the 8th Bomber Command in England and the 12th Bomber Command in Italy. Pilots consistently reported the same advantages: the ability to reach targets faster, maintain formation with less effort, intercept enemy fighters before they could threaten the bombers, and, crucially, choose when to engage and when to withdraw. This last capability was perhaps the most valuable. Superior speed allowed American pilots to control the tactical tempo of aerial battles. The Luftwaffe noticed the change. German intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that, as early as June 1944, the German Air Force High Command had identified a variant of the P-47 with significantly superior performance to the standard model. Technical analyses based on combat observations correctly concluded that the difference lay in wing geometry. A memorandum dated June 23, signed by General Adolf Galland, Luftwaffe fighter commander, acknowledged that the Allies had gained a measurable aerodynamic advantage and recommended accelerating the development of jet fighters to compensate for the lag. But the German jets, though technologically revolutionary, arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, entered service only in July 1944, and production never exceeded a few hundred units due to constant bombing raids on factories and critical shortages of fuel and materials. Meanwhile, American production of modified P-47s grew exponentially. By August, over 1,200 aircraft were operating with the new wing. By September, that number surpassed 2,000. The statistical impact was undeniable. Between April and September of 1944, bomber loss rates on missions escorted by modified P-47s dropped by 32% compared to the previous period. Each bomber saved represented 10 crew members returning alive, in addition to preserving aircraft that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and months of industrial labor to produce. The 200 km/h advantage that the modified wing provided was not just an abstract technical number. It was the difference between intercepting an attack before it began and reacting too late to avoid casualties. Clark, now promoted to colonel and group commander, wrote a detailed technical report in October 1944, analyzing 87 combat missions flown with the modified aircraft. The document, classified as confidential at the time and declassified only in 1963, concluded that the redesigned wing had fundamentally altered the tactical equation of aerial combat. For the first time, Allied escort fighters not only reacted to threats but also preemptively controlled them. Air superiority over Western Europe, which had cost years of bloody combat and thousands of lives, was finally decisively consolidated. Kartveli never became a widely known name outside of aviation technical circles. He gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and rarely spoke about his work outside of a strictly professional context. After the war, he continued designing aircraft for Republic Aviation, including the F-84 Thunderjet, the first American jet fighter to enter mass production. He worked with the same quiet meticulousness that had characterized the development of the modified wing, solving complex problems with mathematical elegance and testing solutions through practical experiments before relying on abstract theories. Beckett pursued an academic career after the war, becoming a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Michigan. In his classes, he frequently used the case of the modified P-47 wing as an example of how real technical innovation emerges not from committees or bureaucratic processes, but from individuals willing to question established assumptions and persist in the face of institutional rejection. He emphasized that Kartveli had not sold the idea through persuasive presentations, but by building functional prototypes that rendered the discussion irrelevant. The lesson was clear. In engineering, measurable results always trump theoretical arguments. Howard, the test pilot who had made the prototype's first flight, returned to active duty as a flight instructor after the war. He trained hundreds of young pilots in the following years, imparting not only piloting techniques, but also a philosophy of deeply understanding aircraft behavior. Howard believed that pilots should think like engineers, understanding the physical forces acting on their machines, not simply memorizing procedures. Many of his students became test pilots or aeronautical engineers, perpetuating the analytical approach he valued. The modified wing, which began as a rejected design on Kartveli's desk, ended up being installed on more than 4,500 aircraft by the end of World War II. Its technical legacy influenced jet fighter design for decades to come, establishing principles of high-speed aerodynamics that remain relevant today. But perhaps its most significant impact was demonstrating that disruptive innovation often comes from individuals who combine deep technical knowledge with a willingness to challenge established consensus, even when it means facing institutional skepticism and repeated rejection. The story of the impossible wing isn't about dramatic heroism or accidental discoveries. It's about methodical persistence, analytical rigor, and the quiet courage to believe empirical data when it contradicts conventional wisdom. It's about understanding that true technological revolutions are rarely accepted immediately, but need to be proven through tangible results that render the discussion obsolete. And it's about recognizing that sometimes the difference between impossible and inevitable is simply someone willing to build the prototype and observe what happens. If this story about how engineering, persistence, and technical thinking changed the course of battles in the skies over Europe during World War II piqued your interest, subscribe to the channel to follow more forgotten stories of military innovation and engineering. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this narrative and share it with those who value real stories of how ideas considered impossible were transformed into decisive advantages. History is full of innovations that changed wars not through brute force, but through applied intelligence and the courage to think differently.